Silence fell over the dining room the moment he walked in. Lorenzo Bianchi didn't need to shout to command a room. His mere presence suffocated it. At table 4, Selina stood with a silver tray trembling in her hands, completely unaware that her quiet, invisible life was about to violently derail. Most people believe the criminal underworld is solely built on brute force and intimidation, but true control is entirely psychological. It boils down to a single moment, a single test of character under immense pressure. Tonight, Lorenzo was looking for a very specific answer, and Selina's response wouldn't just save her life, it would upend his entire empire. Neon lights from the Chicago streets bled through the frosted glass of Osteria Valerius, casting long, distorted shadows across the imported marble floors. It was a Tuesday evening, typically a slow night for the high-end Italian establishment, nestled in the heart of the Gold Coast, but the air inside was thick with a frantic, suffocating energy. Selina stood near the service station, her white apron perfectly pressed, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, utilitarian bun. At 26, Selina had mastered the art of becoming part of the wallpaper. She wasn't paid to be seen. She was paid to facilitate the seamless execution of luxury. She lived a life partitioned into rigid compartments. There was the chaotic, terrifying reality of her cramped apartment in Logan Square, where unpaid bills for her younger sister Lily's specialized cardiac treatments piled up on the kitchen counter like a paper mountain of doom. And then there was this world, a world of truffles, vintage Barolo, and people who spent more on a single appetizer than Selina made in a grueling 40-hour week. Arthur Pendleton, the restaurant's perpetually flushed general manager, darted past her, his forehead gleaming with a cold sweat. He was frantically adjusting the floral arrangement on the centerpiece of the secluded VIP booth in the back corner. "Everything has to be flawless," Arthur hissed to a passing busboy, his voice trembling. "If there is so much as a water spot on a single glass, I will personally see to it that you never work in this city again. Do you understand?" Selina watched the panic unfold with detached observation. She knew who was coming. The whispers had started in the kitchen an hour ago, traveling faster than a grease fire. Lorenzo Bianchi had made a reservation. In the sprawling, intricate web of the Chicago syndicate, the Bianchi family was the undisputed apex predator. Lorenzo, who had inherited the throne at the impossibly young age of 32 after his father's sudden and violent passing in a boating accident on Lake Michigan, was a different breed of boss. He didn't operate in the shadows of back alleys. He operated in high-rise boardrooms, luxury penthouses, and exclusive country clubs. He was a phantom wrapped in bespoke Italian wool, known equally for his ruthless business acumen and his chilling, emotionless demeanor. "I can't do it, Arthur," whispered Sarah, one of the senior waitresses, clutching a stack of menus to her chest as if they could act as body armor. Her eyes were wide with genuine terror. Last time the Bianchi crew was here, Silvio, his underboss, threatened to cut off the sommelier's fingers because the wine was corked. "I have kids. I can't serve that table." Arthur looked like he was about to weep. He scanned the room, his desperate gaze sweeping over the staff who were suddenly very interested in polishing already gleaming cutlery. His eyes landed on Selina. "Selina," Arthur barked, his voice cracking slightly. "You're on the VIP booth tonight." Selina didn't flinch. She simply nodded, placed her polishing cloth on the counter, and picked up her order pad. She didn't have the luxury of fear. Fear didn't pay Dr. Aris Sterling's exorbitant consultation fees at Northwestern Memorial. Fear didn't buy Lily's medication. "Are you insane?" Sarah hissed, grabbing Selina's arm as she walked past. "Do you know who he is? He's a monster." If you look at him the wrong way, you're dead." "I don't plan on looking at him at all," Selina replied softly, gently prying Sarah's fingers off her arm. "I plan on serving him his dinner." 5 minutes later, the front doors swung open, and the temperature in the room seemed to plummet 10 degrees. 4 men in dark, perfectly tailored suits entered first, their eyes scanning the room with predatory efficiency. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace, checking exits, assessing blind spots, and quietly intimidating every patron they passed. Then, Lorenzo Bianchi walked in. He was strikingly handsome, but it was a cold, statuesque kind of beauty. High cheekbones, a sharp, uncompromising jawline, and eyes as dark and unfathomable as the depths of the ocean at midnight. He wore a charcoal suit that draped flawlessly over his broad shoulders, and he moved without a wasted gesture. There was no swagger, no arrogant strut, only the quiet, terrifying confidence of a man who owned everything his eyes touched. He was accompanied by an older man, heavily jowled and sweating profusely, despite the cool air conditioning. Selina recognized him from the local news. Dominic Vieri, a notoriously corrupt city alderman who had been instrumental in rezoning the waterfront district. Selina took a deep breath, smoothing her apron, and walked toward the epicenter of the storm. "Good evening, gentlemen," Selina said, her voice perfectly modulated, warm but professional, deferential but not submissive. "Welcome to Osteria Valerius. May I start you with sparkling or still water?" Lorenzo didn't look at her. He was staring intensely at Alderman Vieri, who was currently attempting to wedge his large frame comfortably into the plush leather booth. "Still," Lorenzo murmured, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in Selina's chest. "And for you, sir?" Selina asked, turning to Vieri. "Whiskey," Vieri snapped, wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief. "Neat. Make it a double. Macallan 18, if you have it." "Right away," Selina said, turning on her heel. When she returned with the drinks, the tension at the table had escalated from uncomfortable to toxic. She approached from Lorenzo's blind side, adhering strictly to high-end service etiquette, and gracefully set the glasses down. As she poured the still water into Lorenzo's crystal goblet, she became a fly on the wall, an invisible entity observing a high-stakes game of chess. "The permits were supposed to be finalized on Friday, Dominic," Lorenzo said, his tone conversational, yet laced with a subtle venom. He slowly traced the rim of his water glass with his index finger. "It is now Tuesday. My development team has excavators sitting idle at $20,000 a day. I do not like paying for idle machinery." "Listen, Lorenzo, you have to understand the political climate," Vieri stammered, taking a massive gulp of his whiskey. His hand shook slightly, causing the amber liquid to slosh against the sides of the glass. "The new zoning commissioner, Mayor Reynolds. She's pushing back. She's asking questions about the shell corporations. I need more time to grease the right palms." "I didn't bring you here to listen to your excuses, Dominic," Lorenzo replied softly. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "I brought you here to understand your loyalty, because right now, the delay feels less like bureaucratic red tape and more like a stalling tactic. Tell me, have you been having dinners with the Falco Syndicate?" Vieri's face drained of color. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. "No, God, no, Lorenzo. I swear to you, I'm your man in City Hall, always have been." Selina stood a few feet away, her back perfectly straight, holding her service tray. She was trained to look straight ahead, to blur her vision to give the guests privacy. But her peripheral vision was sharp. She noticed the details. She noticed how Silvio, Lorenzo's hulking bodyguard standing a few paces away, shifted his weight to his right leg freeing his left hand to hover near his jacket lapel. More importantly, she noticed Vieri. The alderman was sweating profusely. Yes, but it wasn't just fear. It was anticipation. As Lorenzo turned his head slightly to address Silvio, Selina saw Vieri's left hand slip beneath the table. It was a microscopic movement, almost imperceptible. When his hand returned to the table, resting near Lorenzo's water glass, Selina saw the faintest residue of a white powder on Vieri's thumb. Her heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had grown up in a rough neighborhood. She knew what someone slipping a Mickey looked like. But this wasn't a dive bar, and these weren't frat boys. This was a Mafia boss, and a desperate politician cornered like a rat. If Vieri was poisoning Lorenzo, and Lorenzo drank it, chaos would erupt in the middle of the restaurant. Bullets would fly. Innocent people, her co-workers herself, could be caught in the crossfire. If she spoke up and accused Vieri, Lorenzo might not believe her. Vieri was a powerful man. He could deny it, and Selina would be a dead woman walking, a target for a corrupt politician trying to cover his tracks. Lorenzo turned back to the table, his dark eyes locking onto Vieri. He reached for his water glass. Selina had less than 3 seconds to make a decision that would alter the trajectory of her life forever. She took a step forward. "Excuse me, Mr. Bianchi, are you ready to hear the chef's specials?" Selina asked, her voice ringing out slightly louder than necessary, cutting through the heavy atmosphere like a siren. Lorenzo paused, his fingers wrapping around the stem of the poisoned glass. He looked up at her, an expression of profound irritation crossing his features. "We need a few more minutes." "Of course, sir," Selina said. She stepped closer, reaching across the table to collect Vieri's empty whiskey glass. As she pulled her arm back, she deliberately hooked her wrist under the base of Lorenzo's water glass. With a swift, calculated flick, she tipped the heavy crystal goblet backward. The glass shattered against the edge of the mahogany table, sending a tidal wave of ice and tainted water directly into Lorenzo Bianchi's lap. The silence that followed was absolute. The entire restaurant seemed to collectively stop breathing. The clinking of silverware ceased. The low hum of conversation vanished. Lorenzo stood up slowly, water dripping from the edge of his expensive jacket down his trousers. His face was an unreadable mask of cold stone. Silvio was across the room in a fraction of a second, shoving Selina roughly by the shoulder. She stumbled backward, barely catching herself on an empty chair. Silvio's hand was inside his jacket, his eyes locked on Selina with murderous intent. "I am so incredibly sorry, sir," Selina gasped, wide-eyed, playing the part of the terrified, clumsy waitress to perfection. She grabbed a pristine white linen napkin from an empty setting and began frantically dabbing at the pool of water on the table, carefully wiping up the area where the powder had been. "My foot caught the edge of the rug. It was entirely my fault. I'll cover the dry cleaning, I swear." Arthur Pendleton came sprinting from the kitchen, looking like he was on the verge of a massive coronary. "Mr. Bianchi, good God, I am so sorry. This girl is new. She's incompetent. She's fired immediately. Please, let me take you to the back room. We can—" "Silence." Lorenzo's voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a weight that crushed everything else in the room. Arthur snapped his mouth shut instantly. Silvio froze, his hand still inside his coat. Lorenzo looked down at his ruined suit, then looked at the shattered glass on the floor. He slowly wiped a drop of water from his cheek. He didn't look angry. He looked intensely curious. He waved Silvio away with a flick of his wrist. "Stand down." He slowly turned his gaze to Selina. His dark eyes seemed to pierce straight through her skull, cataloguing every micro-expression on her face. He saw the tremble in her hands, the paleness of her cheeks, But he also saw something else. He saw the steady, unblinking focus in her eyes. It was a look he recognized. It was the look of a survivor. "What is your name?" Lorenzo asked quietly, ignoring the chaotic energy of the room. "Selina, sir," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline roaring in her ears. Lorenzo stepped closer to her, invading her personal space. He smelled of expensive cologne, rain, and danger. He looked down at the table, then specifically at Dominic Vieri, who was practically hyperventilating in his seat, his eyes darting frantically toward the door. "A clumsy waitress," Lorenzo mused, speaking softly, so only Selina and Vieri could hear him. "An unfortunate accident. Tell me, Selina, do you believe in accidents?" "I believe people make mistakes, sir," Selina said carefully. Lorenzo smiled. It was a terrifying, razor-thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I don't. In my world, accidents are simply poorly planned assassinations." He leaned down slightly, bringing his face level with hers. "Let us play a game of hypotheticals, Selina. Suppose a powerful man is sitting at a table with an untrustworthy associate. Suppose this invisible, observant waitress sees this associate slip a potent, untraceable neurotoxin into the powerful man's drink while he is distracted." Vieri gasped, pushing himself back into the leather booth, his face turning the color of ash. Lorenzo ignored him, keeping his eyes locked on Selina. This waitress is faced with a dilemma. If she screams and points the finger, the associate, who has powerful friends in the police department, will ensure she disappears. If she stays silent, the powerful man dies, and she takes her meager tip and goes home, complicit in murder. Lorenzo took one step closer, his voice dropping to an intimate, dangerous whisper. "I have a question for you, Selina. If you were that waitress, what would you do? Do you warn the boss and risk the wrath of the politician? Or do you say nothing and let the boss drink?" Selina looked at him, realizing the absolute gravity of the moment. He knew. Lorenzo Bianchi was entirely aware of what she had just done and why she had done it. He wasn't testing her honesty. He was testing her intellect. He was testing her mettle. She stood up straight, abandoning the frightened waitress persona, and looked the most dangerous man in Chicago dead in the eye. "I wouldn't do either, Mr. Bianchi," Selina said, her voice dropping the customer service lilt, becoming flat and grounded. "If I warn the boss, I become a target for a desperate, cornered animal. If I say nothing, I become a murderer by proxy, and a dead man leaves no tip." "So," Lorenzo murmured, his eyes glittering with a dark, intense fascination. "What is the third option?" "I would accidentally drop the glass," Selina said, her voice steady and unapologetic. "I would spill the drink, ruin the suit, and take the abuse. A clumsy waitress gets yelled at. A clumsy waitress gets fired. But the powerful man lives to deal with his own trash. The politician doesn't know what I saw, and I walk out the back door alive to pay my sister's medical bills." The silence stretched between them, taut as a piano wire. Then, Lorenzo Bianchi did something that made his bodyguard, Silvio, openly stare in shock. Lorenzo tipped his head back and laughed. It was a genuine dark chuckle that vibrated through the silent restaurant. He stopped laughing abruptly, turning his attention to Dominic Vieri. "Silvio," Lorenzo said, his voice cold as liquid nitrogen. "Yes, boss." "Mr. Vieri is feeling unwell. It seems the political climate has given him a severe case of indigestion," Lorenzo commanded, casually straightening his ruined cuffs. "Take him to the warehouse on 9th Street. Make sure he receives adequate medical attention until I arrive." "Wait, Lorenzo! Please, it was a mistake! They forced me!" Vieri screamed as Silvio and another massive man hauled him out of the booth, dragging him, kicking and screaming, through the back exit of the kitchen, ignoring the horrified stares of the kitchen staff. Lorenzo watched them drag the politician away, then turned back to Selina. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a sleek, black leather wallet. He extracted a crisp $100 bill and placed it on the damp table. "For the dry cleaning," Lorenzo said softly. He turned and began to walk toward the exit. The remaining bodyguards flanked him instantly. Just as he reached the door, he paused and looked back over his shoulder at Selina, who was still standing by the shattered glass. "You're fired, Selina," Lorenzo called out across the dining room, his voice echoing in the dead silence. Before Selina could process the sinking feeling in her stomach, Lorenzo added, "A woman with your level of perception and problem-solving skills is entirely wasted carrying plates. Be outside your apartment building tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. sharp. A car will be waiting." He stepped out into the Chicago night, leaving Selina standing amidst the ruins of her old life, terrified of the new one that had just begun. Are you ready for the next parts of the story, where Selina is pulled out of her ordinary life and thrust deep into the dangerous, high-stakes inner circle of the Bianchi Syndicate? Morning arrived in Logan Square with the harsh, unforgiving light of a city that never stopped grinding. Selina stood on the cracked pavement outside her apartment building, the frigid Chicago wind biting through her thin wool coat. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, a text from her younger sister, Lily, currently hooked up to a telemetry monitor at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. "Don't do anything stupid, Claire Bear. I love you." Selina slipped the phone away, her jaw tight. She had spent the entire sleepless night questioning her own sanity. Lorenzo Bianchi was a lethal predator. Stepping into his car was tantamount to stepping into a cage. But the memory of the eviction notice taped to her door and the staggering sums on Dr. Aris Sterling's medical invoices left her with exactly zero alternatives. Precisely at 8 a.m., a jet-black Mercedes Maybach glided to the curb, moving with a heavy, armored silence. The rear passenger door swung open. Silvio was sitting in the front passenger seat, his massive frame practically eclipsing the window. He didn't turn around, but Selina could feel his disdain radiating through the leather seats. She climbed into the back, the door shutting behind her, with a definitive, vacuum-sealed thud that entirely muted the street noise outside. "Good morning," Selina said to the driver, a sharply dressed man with a severe buzz cut. He offered no response, merely shifting the luxury vehicle into drive and pulling seamlessly into the morning traffic. They bypassed the gritty neighborhoods of the West Side and merged onto the highway, heading toward the towering glass spires of the Loop. 20 minutes later, the Maybach descended into a private, subterranean parking garage beneath a gleaming skyscraper on Wacker Drive. Selina was escorted into an exclusive elevator that required a retinal scan from Silvio to operate. There were no buttons. The car simply shot upward, leaving Selina's stomach on the ground floor. When the polished steel doors parted, Selina stepped into a world of terrifying opulence. The penthouse suite served as the legitimate corporate headquarters for Bianchi Enterprises. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, panoramic view of Lake Michigan. The decor was aggressively minimalist, black marble, brushed steel, and abstract art that likely cost more than Selina's entire lifetime earning potential. Lorenzo Bianchi stood by the sprawling glass window, his back to her, a steaming cup of espresso in his hand. He was dressed impeccably in a midnight blue tailored suit, looking less like a street-level gangster and more like a ruthless Fortune 500 CEO. "Sit, Selina," Lorenzo commanded softly, not bothering to turn around. She walked over to the sprawling mahogany desk and took a seat in a rigid leather chair, keeping her posture perfect and her hands folded in her lap. Lorenzo turned, his dark eyes locking onto hers with that same suffocating intensity she remembered from the restaurant. He walked slowly around the desk and tossed a thick manila folder onto the pristine wood surface. "Open it," he instructed. Selina hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching out and flipping the cover open. Her heart immediately dropped into her stomach. Inside were medical records. Lily's medical records. Detailed charts from Dr. Aris Sterling, financial statements from Northwestern Memorial Hospital, her own credit card debt summaries, and a comprehensive background check dating back to her high school graduation. "You are 26 years old," Lorenzo stated, his voice a smooth, dangerous baritone, leaning against the edge of his desk. "You dropped out of DePaul University your sophomore year to care for your sister when your mother passed away. You work 60 hours a week. You possess an IQ of 142, yet you serve pastor to arrogant politicians. You are drowning in debt, Selina, but you have no criminal record, no drug habits, and a remarkable tolerance for high-stress situations." Selina looked up, her expression hardening. "Is there a point to this invasion of privacy, Mr. Bianchi?" Lorenzo's lips twitched upward into the ghost of a smile. He liked her defiance. "The point, Selina, is leverage. But more importantly, the point is comprehension. I need to know the exact price of the soul I am buying." "My soul isn't for sale," Selina replied evenly, though her pulse hammered against her throat. "Everything is for sale," Lorenzo corrected, taking a sip of his espresso. "Let us dispense with the moral posturing. Last night, you saved my life. You proved you can think 3 moves ahead of the board, and you possess an extraordinary talent for blending into the background. You are invisible." He set his cup down and leaned closer, the scent of bergamot and expensive leather washing over her. "My organization has a leak. Someone in my inner circle is passing information to the Falco Syndicate. The hit at Osteria Valerius was not Alderman Vieri's idea. He is far too stupid to acquire military-grade neurotoxins. Someone handed him that poison and promised him protection. Someone who knew exactly where I would be sitting and exactly what time I would be distracted." Selina felt a chill run down her spine. "An inside job." "Precisely," Lorenzo murmured. "My lieutenants are inherently suspicious of each other. My bodyguards are loyal, but severely lack nuance. If I bring in an outside interrogator, the rat will immediately go underground. I need someone who does not exist in my world." "A ghost." He reached over and tapped the manila folder. "I want you to become my executive assistant. You will organize my schedules, attend my meetings, and pour my drinks. You will become part of the furniture. And while everyone ignores the pretty, quiet secretary, you will watch them. You will study their micro-expressions, track their allegiances, and find the traitor." Selina stared at the medical documents. "And if I refuse?" "You walk out that door," Lorenzo said simply, gesturing toward the elevator. "I owe you my life, Selina. I do not kill those who save me. But you go back to the restaurant, and within 3 months, Dr. Sterling drops your sister from the experimental trial due to lack of funds." He pulled a sleek black pen from his inside pocket and placed it on the desk. "If you accept, your sister's medical debts vanish today. I have already set up a blind trust to cover all future treatments. You will earn a salary of $500,000 a year, and when you find my rat, you will receive a bonus large enough to permanently relocate you and your sister to any safe haven on Earth." Selina looked at the pen. It felt like she was staring at a loaded gun. Stepping into the Bianchi family business meant crossing a line from which there was no return. She would be complicit in whatever violence Lorenzo unleashed upon the traitor. But then she thought of Lily's pale face, the terrifying hum of the hospital machinery, and the crushing weight of their poverty. Selina picked up the pen. "Who are my primary suspects?" she asked, her voice steady and resolute. Lorenzo's dark eyes gleamed with genuine approval. "We begin tonight." 2 weeks later, Selina had flawlessly assimilated into the shadowy, high-stakes ecosystem of the Bianchi Empire. Her cheap waitress uniform had been replaced by understated, ruthlessly elegant designer wear. She shadowed Lorenzo constantly, a silent, hyper-observant phantom carrying a leather-bound iPad, blending into the opulent backgrounds of private clubs, underground casinos, and backroom negotiations. She quickly learned the key players. There was Silvio, the fiercely loyal, brute force enforcer. There was Matteo, the brilliant but volatile street-level capo. And then there was Dante Bianchi, Lorenzo's cousin and the chief financial officer of the organization's legitimate and illegitimate fronts. Dante was charismatic, perpetually tanned, and wore suits slightly too loud for a man handling millions in laundered cash. Tonight, the chessboard was set at the Drake Hotel in the Gold Coast neighborhood. Ostensibly, it was a high-society charity gala, raising funds for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. In reality, it was neutral ground for a fragile parley between Lorenzo and Salvatore Falco, the aging, venomous boss of the rival syndicate. The grand ballroom was a sea of crystal chandeliers, flowing champagne, and thinly veiled hostility. Selina stood 3 paces behind Lorenzo, wearing a sleek emerald-green silk dress that was deliberately cut to look expensive, but unremarkable. "Remember," Lorenzo murmured, his lips barely moving as he surveyed the room. "Salvatore is a distraction. He talks loudly to hide the moves he makes in silence. Do not watch him. Watch my men." "Understood," Selina whispered back, her eyes scanning the crowd. Salvatore Falco approached, flanked by his own imposing detail. The 2 bosses exchanged pleasantries that sounded more like death threats, smiling for the elite socialites and politicians swirling around them. Selina ignored the verbal sparring and tuned her focus to the periphery. She watched Silvio, who was tense, his hand hovering near his waistline. She watched Matteo, who was glaring openly at Falco's men. Then she looked at Dante. Dante was standing near the extravagant ice sculpture, a glass of champagne in his hand, chatting amiably with a state senator. At a glance, he was the picture of relaxed confidence. But Selina had spent the last 2 weeks analyzing his baseline behavior. Dante usually tapped his index finger against his glass when he was genuinely relaxed. Tonight, his grip was rigid, his knuckles white. More importantly, Selina noticed his eyes. They weren't tracking the conversation with the senator. They were constantly darting toward the secondary ballroom doors on the east wing. Selina seamlessly drifted through the crowd, adjusting her trajectory to get a better angle on the east wing doors. She pretended to review a schedule on her iPad while keeping her peripheral vision locked on the exit. A tall man in a tuxedo, with a distinctive red silk pocket square, exited the east doors. Selina recognized him immediately from the syndicate files she had memorized. Julian the Razor Rossi, Falco's top assassin. Rossi didn't look at Salvatore, and he didn't look at Lorenzo. He casually checked his gold watch, then ran a hand through his hair. Across the room, Selina saw Dante immediately reach up and adjust his own tie, a mirror signal. Dante then casually stepped away from the senator, pulling his phone from his pocket, and began walking directly toward Lorenzo. "Lorenzo," Dante said, his voice carrying an urgent, hushed tone as he interrupted the tense conversation with Falco. "My apologies, Salvatore. Lorenzo, we have a problem with the offshore accounts. The feds are raiding the Cayman Shell Company as we speak. We need to step into the private East Wing lounge immediately to wipe the servers." Lorenzo's jaw tightened. "Now?" Every second we waste, the paper trail thickens, Dante insisted, his eyes wide with perfectly feigned panic. Lorenzo nodded sharply, turning to excuse himself from Falco. He began moving toward the east wing doors. Selina's mind raced. The east wing. Rossi had just come from there. Dante was steering Lorenzo into an isolated room during a chaotic gala. It wasn't a server wipe. It was an execution. She had seconds. She couldn't scream, and she couldn't openly accuse Lorenzo's own blood cousin in front of 2 rival Mafia families and half the Chicago elite. Selina moved with terrifying speed, cutting a sharp angle through the crowd, stepping directly into Lorenzo's path, just as he reached for the brass handle of the east wing door. "Mr. Bianchi, forgive me," Selina said smoothly, her voice a perfect octave of administrative urgency. She thrust the iPad directly into his chest, forcing him to stop and look down. On the screen was not a schedule, but a hastily typed note in bold, glaring text. Dante mirrored, Rossi. "East wing is a kill box. Do not open the door." Lorenzo froze. His dark eyes flicked from the glowing screen up to Selina's face. She maintained her composure perfectly, playing the part of the stressed assistant, but her eyes screamed the truth. Behind Lorenzo, Dante stepped forward, impatience bleeding into his tone. "Move aside, Selina. This is family business. Lorenzo, we have to go." Lorenzo slowly lowered the iPad, handing it back to Selina. The temperature around him seemed to plummet. He didn't look at the door. He slowly turned to face his cousin. "You are right, Dante," Lorenzo said softly, the lethal calm returning to his voice. "This is family business, and family should always stick together." Before Dante could process the shift in tone, Lorenzo clamped a vice-like grip onto Dante's shoulder and shoved him violently against the heavy wooden door of the east wing. "Silvio!" Lorenzo barked, his voice finally shattering its restrained volume. The immediate area erupted into organized chaos. Silvio was there in a heartbeat, drawing his weapon under the concealment of his jacket, pressing it discreetly into Dante's ribs. "Open the door, Dante," Lorenzo whispered, pressing his cousin's face against the brass fixture. "If it is just a server wipe, you go first." Dante began to hyperventilate, his confident veneer shattering instantly. "Lorenzo, no, wait, please. Open it," Lorenzo hissed, his eyes dead and unfeeling. When Dante refused, sobbing quietly, Lorenzo reached over and threw the doors open himself, shoving Dante into the dark hallway. 2 suppressed gunshots coughed in the darkness. "Thwip, thwip," Dante shrieked, collapsing backward into the ballroom, clutching his shoulder where a hollow point bullet had just shattered his collarbone. Rossi had been waiting in the dark, finger on the trigger, firing the moment the door swung open, expecting Lorenzo. The ballroom descended into pure pandemonium. Screams echoed off the high ceilings as attendees dropped to the floor. Falco's men drew their weapons, but Lorenzo's crew was already moving with lethal, pre-planned efficiency, establishing a protective phalanx around their boss. Lorenzo stood over his bleeding cousin, a look of profound, chilling disappointment on his face. He looked across the chaos, his eyes finding Selina, who had pressed herself flat against a marble pillar, her heart hammering in her chest. He didn't say a word, but the look he gave her across the terrified, screaming crowd cemented an undeniable truth. She was no longer just an observer. Selina was now the most valuable asset the Bianchi family possessed, and Lorenzo was never, ever going to let her go. The extraction from the Drake Hotel unfolded with brutal precision. In less than 3 minutes from the first gunshot, Selina was forced into the back of a reinforced SUV, its armored shell dulling the sharp chatter of gunfire outside. Lorenzo's convoy surged forward, engines roaring as they carved through the chaos of Chicago's streets, leaving sirens and panic in their wake. Lorenzo sat beside her, his breathing uneven, a streak of Dante's blood marking the pristine cuff of his white shirt. He wasn't raging. There was something far colder in his expression. Betrayal had hollowed him out. In his world, loyalty wasn't optional. It was law, and someone had broken it. They didn't return to the penthouse on Wacker Drive. Instead, the convoy veered north, disappearing into the quiet isolation of Lake Forest. The estate emerged from the darkness like something ancient and untouchable. Iron gates creaked open, swallowing them whole before slamming shut behind, sealing off the outside world as if it had never existed. Selina was guided inside without a word. The house was vast, suffocatingly quiet, its walls lined with dark wood and shadow. She was left in a sprawling library, lit only by the flicker of a roaring fireplace. The scent of aged paper, leather bindings, and lingering cigar smoke filled the air. She wrapped her arms tightly around herself, her body finally registering the shock. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, trembling exhaustion that seeped into her bones. Time stretched thin. 10 minutes felt like an hour. When Lorenzo entered, he looked like a man unraveling at the edges. His jacket was gone, his collar open, his composure fractured. He didn't acknowledge her immediately. Instead, he crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps, stopping at a crystal decanter resting on a side table. He poured 2 glasses of bourbon, the amber liquid catching the firelight. Without looking at her, he extended 1 glass in her direction. Selina hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it, her fingers brushing the cool glass. Only then did Lorenzo meet her eyes. "Drink," he said quietly. It wasn't a suggestion. Selina took a sip, the amber liquid burning a fiery, grounding trail down her throat. "Dante?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. "In the basement with Silvio," Lorenzo replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "The bullet shattered his clavicle. A doctor has patched him up just enough to ensure he stays conscious for the questions." He stared into the fire, the orange flames dancing in his dark eyes. "My own blood, Selina. He sold me to Falco for a larger slice of the waterfront shipping routes." He slowly turned his gaze to her. The look in his eyes was stripped of the cold, corporate Mafia boss facade. It was raw, predatory, and undeniably intimate. "You saved my life, again." "I was doing my job, Mr. Bianchi," Selina deflected, staring down at her glass. "You hired an invisible observer." Lorenzo closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He reached out, his large, warm hand gently gripping her chin, forcing her to look up at him. The air between them instantly crackled with a terrifying, electric tension. "Do not insult my intelligence, and do not minimize your own brilliance," Lorenzo murmured, his thumb brushing lightly against her jawline. "A hired employee screams. A hired employee runs. You stepped into the line of fire and calculated a countermove in less than 3 seconds. You are not just an observer, Selina. You are a tactician." Selina's breath hitched. She was acutely aware of his proximity, the heat radiating from his chest, the faint scent of gunpowder and bergamot clinging to his skin. "What happens now?" she whispered. "Now, the shadow war ends, and the real war begins," Lorenzo said, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. "Falco will know Dante failed. He will realize his mole is burned. He will strike like a cornered animal, and he will target the things I value most." He released her chin, but he didn't step back. Instead, he pulled his phone from his pocket and tapped a screen. He handed it to Selina. It was a live security feed of a hospital room. Lily was fast asleep, her vitals steadily blipping on the monitor beside her bed. But outside her door stood 2 enormous men in dark suits. Selina recognized them, They were Lorenzo's elite personal guards. I moved them there the moment the shooting started, Lorenzo explained. Dr. Sterling has also been relocated to a secure wing. As long as you are with me, your family is untouchable. That is not a business negotiation, Selina. That is a vow. Tears stung Selina's eyes, but she blinked them back. For years she had fought the crushing weight of the world alone. She had scrubbed floors, served arrogant patrons, and starved herself just to keep her sister breathing. Now, the most dangerous man in the city was wielding his terrifying power to build a fortress around them. "Why?" Selina asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The debt is paid. I found your rat. Why are you doing this?" Lorenzo reached out, his hand sliding to the nape of her neck, his fingers tangling in the loose strands of her dark hair. "Because you belong to me now," he said, the words heavy with dark, possessive certainty. "I tested a waitress to see if she had the stomach for my world. I did not expect to find a queen who could rule it beside me." Before Selina could process the magnitude of his words, the heavy oak doors of the library burst open. Matteo stood in the doorway, his face pale, gripping a bloody burner phone. "Boss," Matteo panted. "Dante cracked. He gave up Falco's final play." Lorenzo didn't flinch, his hand remaining securely on Selina's neck. "Speak." "Falco isn't going to hide." Matteo swallowed hard. "He knows we have his entire ledger from Dante's phone. He's marshalling his entire crew. They're hitting the Lake Forest estate tonight. In 30 minutes. It's a full siege, Lorenzo. They're coming to wipe us out." The estate plunged into a terrifying, organized frenzy. Sirens wailed across the sprawling grounds as perimeter defenses were activated. Floodlights carved through the darkness, illuminating the dense forest surrounding the property. Inside, the sound of assault rifles being chambered echoed off the marble floors. Lorenzo transformed instantly from the intense, vulnerable man in the library back to the ruthless apex predator. He began barking orders, deploying his men to strategic choke points around the mansion. "Matteo, hold the east wing. Silvio, take the armory crew to the front gates. If a single Falco soldier breaches the perimeter, I will feed you to the dogs myself," Lorenzo commanded, sliding a heavy, matte black pistol into his shoulder holster. He turned to Selina, grabbing her firmly by the shoulders. "There is a panic room beneath the wine cellar. It is encased in 3 feet of reinforced steel. You will go down there. You will lock the door, and you will not open it until you hear my voice. Do you understand?" Selina looked at the chaotic scene unfolding around them. She saw Lorenzo's men, outnumbered and bracing for a brutal, bloody last stand. Falco was bringing an army. Lorenzo's men were elite, but sheer numbers could overwhelm even the best defenses. "No," Selina said flatly. Lorenzo's eyes widened in genuine shock. "Excuse me?" "You said it yourself, Lorenzo. I am a tactician," Selina countered, her mind racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour, falling into that familiar, cold state of hyperfocus. "Falco is coming with brute force. He expects a siege. He expects you to hunker down and fight a war of attrition. We are not going to give him one." "Selina, this is not a restaurant. This is a bloodbath," Lorenzo growled, trying to physically steer her toward the basement stairs. She dug her heels in, grabbing his wrists. "Listen to me. Dante was the CFO. He handled the money, the shell corporations, the bribes. If Dante surrendered his phone, we don't just have Falco's ledgers. We have his payroll." Lorenzo stopped pushing, his eyes narrowed. "Continue." "Mercenaries and low-level street thugs are loyal to the highest bidder," Selina said, her voice sharp and urgent. "They are marching on this estate expecting a payday from Salvatore Falco. Dante's phone has the direct routing numbers for Falco's offshore payroll accounts. We have Dante locked in the basement, and his biometrics can authorize transfers. Realization dawned on Lorenzo's face, a slow, terrifying smile spreading across his lips. "We don't fight Falco's army," Selina said, her eyes burning with a fierce, brilliant light. "We buy them." 10 minutes later, the air outside the mansion was split by the deafening roar of armored vehicles tearing through the front gates. Falco's men swarmed the lawn, heavily armed and moving aggressively toward the front doors. Salvatore Falco himself stepped out of a black SUV, flanked by his top lieutenants, a cigar clamped between his teeth, savoring the impending slaughter. Inside, in the secure server room, Selina's fingers flew across a mechanical keyboard. Dante, pale and groaning in pain, had his face pressed against the retinal scanner by Silvio. "Access granted," the computerized voice chimed. "I'm in," Selina said, her eyes scanning lines of code and bank routing data. "I see Falco's primary payroll manifest. I'm selecting all active mercenary and street-level crew accounts." "Do it," Lorenzo ordered, standing behind her, his hand resting firmly on her shoulder. Outside, Salvatore Falco raised his hand, preparing to order the breach. Suddenly, a cacophony of digital chimes echoed across the lawn. Hundreds of cell phones, locked in the pockets of Falco's soldiers, began vibrating and pinging simultaneously. Falco frowned, lowering his hand. "What the hell is that?" One of his lieutenants pulled out his phone, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Boss, my Cayman account. I just received a wire transfer. $500,000. Murmurs of shock rippled through the heavily armed crowd. "I just got $1 million, another mercenary shouted from the back. Suddenly, the massive front doors of the mansion slowly swung open. Lorenzo Bianchi stepped out onto the portico, entirely unarmed, wearing a pristine black suit. Selina stepped out right beside him, standing tall and utterly fearless. Lorenzo projected his voice across the stunned, silent lawn. "Gentlemen," Lorenzo called out, his tone conversational and chillingly calm. "As you have just noticed, the Falco Syndicate no longer controls your finances. I have just liquidated Salvatore Falco's entire empire and deposited it directly into your personal accounts. You are officially the highest paid men in Chicago." Falco spit out his cigar, his face turning purple with rage. "Kill him! Kill them both! They're lying!" No one moved. The soldiers looked at their phones, then looked at Lorenzo, and finally looked at the sputtering, impoverished old man standing among them. "You have a choice to make," Lorenzo continued, stepping to the edge of the stairs. "You can die tonight fighting for a bankrupt relic, or you can take your newly acquired wealth, lower your weapons and walk away. Anyone who wishes to stay and pledge their permanent loyalty to the Bianchi family will find that my generosity has only just begun." The silence was deafening. Then a heavy clatter rang out. The lieutenant standing closest to Falco dropped his assault rifle onto the cobblestones. Within seconds, a cascade of metal echoed across the estate as hundreds of weapons were abandoned. Men began turning their backs on Salvatore Falco, streaming out the shattered gates, taking their lives and their money into the night. Falco stood entirely alone, trembling with impotent fury. Lorenzo turned to Silvio, who had stepped out of the shadows. "Clean up the trash," Lorenzo said softly. As Silvio moved down the stairs toward the ruined boss, Lorenzo turned to Selina. The adrenaline, the danger, and the sheer brilliance of what they had just pulled off hung heavy between them. He didn't hesitate. Lorenzo pulled Selina flush against his chest and kissed her. It was not a gentle, romantic kiss. It was acclaiming, a collision of power, relief, and dark, undeniable passion. Selina kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hands gripping the lapels of his suit, finally shedding the last remnants of the invisible, frightened girl from the restaurant. When they finally broke apart, Lorenzo rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing heavily in the cool night air. "You ruined a perfectly good suit," Lorenzo whispered, a dark, genuine smile touching his eyes. Selina smiled back, a dangerous, confident smirk that mirrored his own. "I'll pay for the dry cleaning." What an absolute thrill ride. From serving plates in a quiet corner of Osteria Valerius to orchestrating the financial collapse of an entire Mafia empire, Selina proved that the deadliest weapon in any room isn't a gun. It's a brilliant, calculating mind. Lorenzo thought he was testing a simple waitress, but he ended up finding the one person sharp enough to claim the throne beside him. Their transition from a cold business arrangement to a fiercely protective dark romance shows that true power is found in ultimate trust. If you loved this intense, twist-filled journey of loyalty, betrayal, and a love forged in the fires of the criminal underworld, please hit that like button. Don't forget to share this story with fellow Mafia romance fans, and subscribe to the channel for more gripping, cinematic storytelling. Drop a comment below. Would you have dropped the glass?